The day began with silence broken only by the crunch of boots on gravel. At Camp Ruston, Louisiana, spring 1945, a line of German women walked through the gate with their eyes fixed on the ground. They had been soldiers, typists, radio operators, nurses, now labeled prisoners of war. The barbed wire glittered under the morning sun like frozen lightning. A young American officer, Lieutenant Charles Everett, called out through a translator, "You'll be working in the kitchen, no chains." The interpreter hesitated before repeating the words in German. One of the women, her name was Helene Kruger, whispered, "We carry chains inside." The phrase hung in the air. Inside the camp, nothing looked like the dungeons they had imagined. There were wooden barracks, white fences, and even a small rose bush near the mess hall. But freedom of movement did not mean freedom of thought. Each of them had memorized the lessons of loyalty, superiority, and silence, drilled into them by the Reich. Their uniforms had been taken away, yet the discipline remained stitched into their posture. They did not speak unless spoken to. Historical records from Fort Oglethorpe and Camp Hearn confirm that female auxiliaries captured in 1945 were treated under Geneva Convention standards, separated from men, but not placed in isolation cells. Instead, they were assigned domestic work, laundry, cooking, cleaning, tasks designed to restore order to broken routines. The irony was brutal. Women once trained for total war now handled pots, not pistols. In the first week, American guards noticed that none of the women laughed. They worked mechanically, eyes lowered, hands trembling whenever an officer passed by. One diary entry from a camp nurse reads, "They are afraid of kindness. It confuses them more than commands. Every night, the floodlights trace their shadows against the wire fence. The women lay awake, haunted by air raid sirens and the echo of marching songs. Freedom felt like another trap, only quieter." One guard said later, "They didn't try to escape because they were already prisoners long before they got here." The story of these women begins not with their capture, but with the moment they realized that the war had taken their humanity before their liberty. The Americans had removed the barbed wire outside. What remained was the barbed wire within. At Camp Aliceville, Alabama, the sewing room smelled of starch and detergent. In early April 1945, a shipment of torn military parachutes arrived from a nearby depot, nylon that had once carried paratroopers into Normandy or dropped food supplies over France. Now, the fabric was to be repurposed under the War Department's recycling program. Sergeant Martha Green, a supply officer, instructed her team to cut the salvaged silk into squares for aprons. "If the war can turn men into enemies," she said, "maybe we can turn its tools into something harmless." When the bundles were delivered to the female POWs, confusion rippled through the barracks. Some hesitated to touch the cloth. Others stared at it in disbelief. One American nurse, Helen Montgomery, wrote in her log, "They wore fabric that once fell from the sky." Among the women was Ruth Werner, formerly a radio operator for the Luftwaffe. She held a strip of parachute silk against the light and whispered, "We used to fear these shadows over Berlin. Now I wear them." The first aprons were crude, uneven seams, mismatched ties. But gradually, the women's training in precision and discipline took over. They measured, ironed, stitched. They embroidered initials at the corners, not of their names, but of the cities they'd lost. H for Hamburg, D for Dresden. Work slowed the racing thoughts. The hum of sewing machines replaced the sirens in their memory. A report filed on June 18, 1945, by the camp superintendent noted, "The female internees show increased morale. Productivity of laundry and kitchen services rose by 27% after the introduction of the sewing assignment." What the report didn't capture was the emotional alchemy occurring beneath the surface. Violence transformed into utility, destruction into care. Ruth wrote in her diary that summer, "Each stitch feels like repairing something in me. These aprons were once meant to catch men falling from the sky. Now they catch flour and soap. Maybe that is what peace looks like." Outside, children from the nearby town pressed their faces against the fence to watch the strange spectacle. German women sewing American parachutes into kitchenware. To them, it was merely curiosity. To the women, it was penance stitched into nylon. That evening, when the bell rang for curfew, Ruth folded her apron neatly and placed it beside her bunk. The fabric was still warm from her hands. She touched it once more before turning off the light. In the darkness, the faint smell of parachute silk lingered, a reminder that even the sky could be recycled into forgiveness. The camp's kitchen became a theater of contradictions. By day, pots clanged and ovens hissed. By night, the same space filled with the low hum of foreign voices, German, English, Polish, blending into something almost like harmony. Camp records from Aliceville and Ruston show that by mid-1945, over 200 German POWs, including women auxiliaries, were employed in food service across U.S. bases. Yet what startled observers most wasn't their obedience, but how quickly they adapted to labor without chains. Each woman received a small wage of 80 cents per day, credited in camp scrip that could buy coffee, soap, or paper at the canteen. The system astonished them. They had been taught that Americans enslaved their prisoners, that defeat meant humiliation. But here, wages replaced punishment. Sergeant Martha Green enforced discipline lightly, a glance, a nod, a word. The same hands that had once transmitted military codes now kneaded bread dough, cleaned stoves, folded napkins. Among the prisoners was a 27-year-old named Margaret Fuchs, formerly a Luftwaffe secretary from Dusseldorf. She arrived with the pride of an officer's aide and the silence of someone who had seen too much. For weeks, she refused to sit beside anyone at meals. Her diary entry, dated July 2nd, reads, "They smile as if the world were whole. I eat standing because I have not earned the right to rest." The camp psychologist later recorded that her posture, rigid, arms crossed even while seated, mirrored the emotional armor of many female captives. One evening, Margaret entered the mess hall late and saw an American nurse sharing stew with wounded German soldiers. The nurse laughed softly at something a prisoner said. No guards shouted, no one recoiled. The moment broke something inside her. She approached the table and whispered in halting English, "May I sit?" No one refused. They ate in silence until Margaret's spoon trembled against the tin bowl. Then she said, half to herself, "No one has eaten beside me without fear since 1943. The nurse reached across the table and adjusted the prisoner's apron, a quiet, almost maternal gesture. Later that night, Margaret wrote, "The taste of the soup stayed long after the warmth left. I think it was not the food that filled me, but being seen." Outside the kitchen, rumors spread among guards that the women smile now. For the first time, they hummed fragments of German lullabies while washing dishes. To the Americans, it sounded like progress. To the women, it was a cautious resurrection, proof that dignity could return, not through speeches or surrender, but through the simple act of sharing a meal. The first letters began as whispers on paper. By late summer 1945, the women at Camp Aliceville had learned that some mail to Germany was being permitted again, though heavily censored. They wrote by lantern light after curfew, using blunt pencils or charcoal from the kitchen stove. Every word carried danger. Too much emotion could be misread. Too much gratitude could be seen as betrayal. Anna Bauer, a 30-year-old Catholic nurse from Cologne, wrote to her sister, "We are alive, though our souls feel misplaced. The Americans give us aprons instead of chains, and I no longer know if I should thank them or weep." That letter never reached Cologne. It was intercepted and archived by the U.S. War Department's Postal Censorship Office in Chicago, labeled Emotional Content Hold. Today, it lies in the German Red Cross archives, fragile and brown around the edges. For Anna, faith became her only form of resistance. One evening, she took a needle and pale thread from the sewing room and stitched a tiny cross into the inside of her apron, hidden against her chest. When a corporal discovered it during inspection, she expected confiscation. Instead, Sergeant Green examined the embroidery and said quietly, "Leave it." The next morning, Green slipped Anna a small piece of blue thread and whispered, "Add this." And together they stitched 3 more words beneath the cross. "Peace tastes like bread." That same month, a local journalist from the Montgomery Advertiser visited the camp and reported on the strange serenity of captured women baking bread. The article ran under the headline, "Aprons of the Enemy." The photograph showed a line of German women smiling faintly, hands dusted with flour, a faint shadow of barbed wire behind them. The image was later used in a War Department pamphlet titled "Mercy in Victory." But the truth behind those smiles was complicated. In her confiscated diary, Anna wrote, "Each time I knead dough, I feel my mother's hands guiding mine. Each loaf is a prayer, not for Germany, not for America, but for something beyond flags." As autumn approached, Red Cross visitors delivered censored news from home. Cities in ruins, families missing, and the first reports from the concentration camps. Many of the women stopped writing after that. Guilt became heavier than fear. Ruth Werner noted in her log, "They no longer ask when they'll go home. They only ask what home still means." The aprons, once mere fabric, had absorbed more than flour and soap. They had become confessionals, stitched with secrets the world was not ready to read. And under every seam, the hidden crosses gleamed faintly in the dim light, symbols of survival and of a faith that no prison could censor. By November 1945, a faint scent of yeast and sugar had replaced the acrid odor of bleach in Camp Shanks, New York. Word had spread through the compound that the women in the kitchen were baking again, this time not for rations, but for learning. An American guard, Corporal Daniel Reeves, had approached Ruth Werner one morning holding a small notebook. "Can you teach us how you bake that bread? The men keep talking about it." Ruth laughed quietly, thinking it was a joke, but he was sincere. That afternoon, Ruth and Anna gathered flour, salt, and a dented aluminum bowl. Reeves and 2 younger guards watched as the women worked. The dough rose slowly under the warmth of their hands. Reeves said, "It's strange. The smell reminds me of the enemy's kitchen." Ruth paused, looked up, and answered softly, "Then we're not enemies anymore." The exchange was later reported in Stars and Stripes, April 1945, under the headline, "POWs Teach Americans the Art of Brochen." It became a minor sensation, a human interest story in a nation eager for symbols of peace. The War Department even circulated the article to camps across the South as proof of constructive re-education. But within the barracks, it was no propaganda. It was a small reconciliation. Statistics from the War Food Administration show that over 15,000 POWs in U.S. custody contributed to food production programs that year, baking, farming, canning. In those kitchens, Germans and Americans often stood shoulder to shoulder, translating recipes by gesture more than language. The women marveled that men who had once bombed their cities now waited patiently for their bread to bake. Ruth's diary captures one unforgettable moment. He burned the first batch, laughed, and said the smell made him homesick. For what, I asked. For a kitchen with someone waiting. Outside, the camp loudspeakers played jazz from New York radio stations. Some guards tapped their boots. Others pretended not to listen. The line between captor and captive blurred with every loaf that came out of the oven. By the end of the week, the guards asked for seconds. As winter crept in, baking classes became a ritual. The ovens glowed like hearths against the cold. One guard carved a wooden spoon and gave it to Ruth with a single word engraved, peace. The question remains for anyone watching this story unfold. Could something as simple as bread undo years of hatred? Would you, if born on either side of that fence, have reached across the table too? Snow began to fall over Alabama in January 1946, dusting the roofs of the barracks and softening the sharp outlines of fences. Camp Aliceville was preparing for repatriation, and tension hung in the air like the chill before dawn. Many of the female prisoners had grown quieter, torn between relief and sorrow. The Americans, too, seemed uncertain, unsure whether to treat these women as guests, workers, or former enemies. To mark the end of their service, the camp command organized a farewell gathering. The women insisted on helping. They decorated the mess hall with paper chains cut from flour sacks and placed loaves of bread on every table. At the last moment, someone suggested a procession, a parade without weapons. So, on a gray morning, 112 German women marched down the dirt road that led to the gate. Instead of rifles, they carried brooms, ladles, and rolling pins. Their aprons fluttered like flags in the wind. Colonel William Hart, the camp commander, stood at the reviewing line. When they halted, he removed his cap, looked at the women, and said simply, "You fought the wrong war, but you can serve the right peace." The interpreter hesitated, then translated every word. A few women bowed their heads, others wept openly. In the front row, Ruth and Anna stood side by side, clutching their aprons like medals. A photographer from the Birmingham Post captured the scene. The image would later circulate across Europe. A column of women in white aprons marching through melting snow, guards saluting them as equals. In post-war Germany, the picture became controversial, proof to some of American compassion, to others of German humiliation. But for those who lived it, it was neither. It was closure. After the ceremony, Margaret Fuchs found herself standing by the fence she had once feared. She reached out and touched the wire, now rusted and brittle, and whispered, "Maybe it's time to leave this here." She removed a thread from her apron and tied it to the fence, a tiny gesture of release. The next day, trains began to depart north toward the ports. Each woman received a small brown parcel, a wool blanket, soap, a Red Cross ration box, and permission to keep one personal item. Most chose photographs or handkerchiefs. A surprising number, however, chose their aprons. As the last convoy rolled away, the American nurses watched in silence. Sergeant Green noted later in her report, "They marched out lighter than they came in." Before the scene fades, pause and ask yourself, when the enemy learns to bake your bread and you learn to salute their courage, who has truly won the war? The war was long over when Ruth Werner stepped off a ship in Bremerhaven in the autumn of 1946. The air smelled of coal and damp wood, and the harbor was crowded with refugees dragging suitcases that looked older than they were. Ruth carried only one thing that mattered, her U.S. Army apron folded carefully in her arms. Customs officers barely looked at her papers. Germany had more returnees than questions. She traveled by train through ruins that once had names: Bremen, Hanover, the outskirts of Hamburg. The fields were black scars where houses used to stand. Children scavenged coal along the tracks. At one stop, she saw a boy wearing a jacket made from army curtains and thought, "We are all stitched together from what was left." When she reached Bremen, she rented a single room above a bakery that had survived the bombings. The owner, a widow named Frau Dietrich, let her use the kitchen on weekends. Ruth began to bake small loaves, at first for neighbors, then for the families who came looking for food or work. Soon she opened her own shop, a wooden sign hand-painted above the door, Freiheitsbrot, freedom bread. Anna Bauer joined her a year later, her hands still steady from hospital service. Together they hired widows and displaced girls, teaching them the same recipes they had learned in captivity. Every morning before dawn, Ruth tied the old white apron around her waist. The faded blue cross still glimmered faintly under the lining, the words, "Peace tastes like bread," barely visible after hundreds of washings. In 1948, a journalist from Neue Zeitung visited the bakery and asked why she had kept the American apron all these years. Ruth smiled and said, "Because it reminds me not of the war, but of the day I was treated as a woman again." The article included a photograph of her standing by the oven, flour on her cheek, a line of fresh loaves cooling behind her. That photo remains in the Bavarian State Archive today. In the evenings, Ruth sometimes dreamed of the camp, the clatter of pans, the smell of yeast, the moment when a guard reached for a spoon instead of a weapon. The apron hung by her bed, yellowed and soft from use, but still whole. To her, it was not a relic of defeat, but proof that even in captivity, decency had survived. She would live long enough to see the next generation of German women open schools, factories, and clinics, no longer defined by uniforms or borders. Some who had once worn aprons beside her sent letters, signed simply, "From one baker to another, with peace." And when Ruth folded the apron for the last time, the light through her window caught its frayed edge like a flag. They had entered captivity in uniform. They left it in aprons and dignity. History often remembers the roar of battles, the parades of victory, and the speeches carved into marble. It forgets the quiet rooms where enemies learn to share silence. In the story of these women, there are no medals, no fanfare, only the steady rhythm of hands repairing what war had broken. Theirs was not a victory of armies, but of spirit, earned with flour, water, and forgiveness. When the female German POWs arrived in America, they believed captivity would strip away their worth. Yet, in unexpected ways, it restored it. They discovered that dignity could survive behind fences, that kindness from an enemy could be more disarming than any weapon. A kitchen became a classroom, an apron became a flag, and a loaf of bread became a declaration that humanity still existed on both sides of the ocean. Across the 500 POW camps that dotted the United States, nearly 371,000 Germans lived this paradox. Conquerors turned laborers, soldiers turned teachers. But among them, the women left a legacy measured not in numbers, but in gestures. A shared meal, a cross stitched in secret, a piece of parachute turned into an apron. They proved that mercy was not weakness. It was reconstruction in its purest form. Long after the gates closed, the echo of their transformation lingered. The American guards returned home with memories of laughter in the kitchens. The German women returned with the knowledge that compassion can survive even under flags at war. History records destruction easily. It struggles to record grace. Yet grace is what endures. Perhaps that is the hidden law of every conflict, that peace is not signed but sown, one stitch, one loaf, one act of forgiveness at a time. And somewhere, in a small bakery in Bremen or a museum glass case in Alabama, an old apron still waits quietly, reminding us what it means to be human again.